Hello, Ramirez here, Tidewater Renaissance Fighting Arts. And I'm doing a part two to a video that I've done largely because of the rather impressive response I had to that original video. But unlike that video, I'm not going to comment if I post a link to this on Facebook. I'm not really going to comment there. I will, just like I have in the previous video, I'll be commenting to the comments that are here in the video, which means you took the time to watch it, and in theory, you've taken the time to look and see what I have to say. Now, before I start my discussion, which is going to be on gauntlets particularly and hand protection in HEMA, I want to start out with some disclaimers. First is that the point of this and the previous video was to say that there is protective gear made out of metal that is potentially better than a lot of the stuff currently on the HEMA market made out of plastic. That was not to say that you couldn't still use, whether it be masks or whether it be gauntlets that are normally in the HEMA market, largely made of plastic. If you want to keep using them for your tournaments, if you're a tournament organizer and you're like, I don't want metal armor in my tournament, you have every right to do that. And I'm not saying that you have to change. If you are a fencer who feels that the advantages of speed and agility that modern HEMA equipment gives you, by all means, keep using it. In fairness, let me explain my point of view. In my first tournament, in my first match, I was waffled wearing a HEMA appropriate regulation mask. I don't think that the argument about we need to depower our fencing in terms of force is an invalid argument. As a matter of fact, I agree with that. And I agree with it from a place of my own personal experience. So I want to be clear that whether or not we should control the amount of force we use in HEMA fencing is a very good argument. It's just not the argument that I'm having right now. So if you're of the mindset that the answer is not better protective equipment, it's better control in our fencing, I agree with you. But I live in a real world where these things do happen. So the idea that Sellsword Arts had put out there that we need better equipment kind of rang with me. And so I felt that we should talk about different types of equipment that are already available and that we could potentially use and implement in our Blossfectin. And I think there's another important note, and I'm not going to talk about helmets today. Maybe I go into a part 3 and we talk about that. But it's not just about HEMA tournaments. And I think that a lot of people, because when I post on Facebook, had a lot of thoughts about how this would affect tournaments. We're seeing a rise in HEMA of doing melee type events. And with that, we're also looking at some people experimenting with heavier and more powerful weapons. Things like, let's say, spears. And spears, if they're being used with wooden shafts, have the potential for greater force than the average longsword in a HEMA tournament. I'm saying potential. It doesn't mean it definitely will happen, but it's something we should maybe look at and look at the HEMA world beyond just tournaments. Look at the fact that as it gets more popular, people are going to want to spar to the standards, because there is not one unified standard, to whatever standards they're used to. And so there may be places, regions where people hit heavier, and should they or not is another discussion. What's important is how can we increase the level of protection that our current equipment gives us. So that's where I'm coming from. As I said, I'm not trying to change the world. I'm not trying to say everyone has to do X, Y, and Z. I'm putting out an idea. And those who are open to that idea, those that have commented on the previous video, we've had some productive talks about the issues with using steel gauntlets or steel helmets. And as I said, today's really going to be a little bit more about the gauntlets themselves. And I'm going to start with gauntlets that I use in HEMA. And those would be the Infinity gloves from Sparring Glove and the Gabriels. And the limitations in, let's say, something like this have to do largely with the 4-digit, the part that goes to the end of the hand, and the fact that this is all one piece, so you have a whole knuckle point that isn't being utilized as far as its bendability. And what that does, it tends, and I've actually taped mine so that that finger doesn't push forward. In a gauntlet with more flexibility, you get better movement with those fingers. You reduce the risk a little bit less. And I want to compare it to a 14th century gauntlet in that it has a hard hourglass kind of design. So if someone says, well, we don't use that in our HEMA gloves versus gauntlets, I want to make the argument we totally do. If we take a look at a Gabriel, and we take a hard look at it, you'll notice there are these little round, and if you have Gabriels, you can kind of find these on there, these little round finials at the knuckle joints. You'll find that we have this big padded piece, and what that's there to prevent is there's another plate. It's kind of hard to see, but to stop going in there, potentially lifting, especially if you don't have a blunt on your fetter, that could enter into where the plate design is. Also, this kind of multi-tiered set of pieces, these actually do slide or open with enough force, so you can see that can kind of lift. These can kind of move around. And these are kind of just some of the various limitations that modern HEMA gloves give, and they have a good degree of flex. If I'm going to try to turn the camera so you can see it, and you can do this if you have your own gloves. If you press on this, you can actually feel it bend. There's a lot of room where the less than ideal protection that this gives you. Now, of course, if you're good enough, if you're a great HEMA fencer, you may never get hit in the hands. The whole point of this even being here is a moot point. I would say that, if you're in the top 10%, you're someone who always medals at tournaments, you're probably less worried about that. But let's say you have a 64-person tournament. That means 3 people are in that tier of the ones that get medals. And there are a lot of people that aren't. There are a lot of people who it's their first time or they aren't as good. Should it really be against them that they should have a better option for protection? I don't think so. So let's get into why a metal gauntlet might give us better protection, what our options are. Now, I brought up this particular gauntlet that I have from Arm Street because it is ridiculously similar to the Gabriel. And I say that because you see that knuckle finial? It's still there. There is a divider plate here, but there's not a knuckle finial there. But the design is actually fundamentally ridiculously similar. But you're not going to get the flex that you would with a Gabriel. When it's struck, there really is very little chance of that bending. And I think that's important to consider when considering the possibility that we could use metal gauntlets. Do I think the design could be improved for HEMA? Yeah, I do. But even as it is, you'll notice I don't need that bulbous point. I talked about this in my other video, because the metal actually goes far enough back that it covers my entire finger. Even if you could jam a sword in here, it actually would get stopped at the top part, and going through, it would actually hit past the actual finger itself, because the plate actually goes all the way to the back of my hand. So there is a lot of potential for better protection with that metal. And this is one of their more basic designs. I want to say it's between $300 and $400, which when we look at some of the higher end things like Gabriel's, go at comparable cost. I'm going to get to how things could improve a little bit later, but I wanted to bring that up. This is a more expensive gauntlet. Once again, if I had a HEMA jacket with an elbow protector, this also gives me full protection of the entirety of the wrist. It has the rider plate, which is a secondary plate above the primary knuckle guard. This makes it harder to reach. And even if you can, with a, let's say, an untipped blade, get in here, you actually would hit the metal here. You can't physically hit the fingers because the finger lane actually covers the entire finger, and then these plates go over those plates. People argue about weight, and I'm sorry, I don't have a gram scale on me, but I can tell you from my own experience, this is slightly heavier than a plastic gauntlet. I would argue that the other gauntlet that I showed you, and I can put them on side by side, that this one and the Gabriel are really quite comparable. Is this lighter? Yes, but not by much. There are, just like there are bad HEMA gauntlets, like the ones that are made of plastic, there are, and I'm talking about like Red Dragons, or when they tried to redo the Red Dragons to have plastic plates on them. There are bad HEMA gloves, and there are bad HEMA gauntlets. Let me go and grab one. So this one is a bad HEMA gauntlet. This would be horrible for HEMA. And I think that this is what a lot of people think of when they think, oh, gauntlets bad, gauntlets for HEMA are bad. But this is a bad gauntlet overall. It's made from a mild steel. It's painted, but it's a mild steel. It's very heavy, particularly this overpiece. It does, you can feel like it's like, I think that you might very well have swords that weigh the same as this gauntlet. Also, the fingers don't go as far back. They have very little coverage. So you'll see that that's a very narrow plate versus the plates that I was showing you in the other gauntlet. The fingers are very far outside of where the protective plate is. The whole thing is held together by one strap and a couple of stitches at the very top of the fingers. So the rest of the finger is actually, if I pull this back, you kind of see, or maybe if I take my hand out of it, you kind of see that the finger is not really connected to the rest of the plates. I can literally put my finger between the glove and the actual metal. And I would argue that, yes, if this is your standard for what a HEMA gauntlet, why we shouldn't be using metal gauntlets, I'd agree with you. But I think we'd both also agree that the regular red dragons aren't great for competitive HEMA or for a lot of the other HEMA activities we do. So it's not that there are good designs and there are bad designs. And realistically, if there was a demand for metal gloves, they would get better. In other words, I'm not entirely sold that this is dished far enough. It is sewn in better than the one I showed you, but I think that if HEMAists wanted a glove where there was metal that had a little further protection in the fingers, we could get it. It's right now there just isn't a demand for it. Could that be something in the future that we could get? Yeah, because if there was a demand for it, someone would start making it. Materials matter. I know that some people talked about the maintenance. And these are stainless steel. I've worn them outside. I really don't have any issues with rust with these. And they've done quite a nice job. There's also titanium. And I don't have a titanium glove to show you, but if you go to the comments section, I'm going to put a video that I did with a manufacturer who does make titanium gauntlets, and I want to show you that they have this guy made them with an enclosed thumb. He made them with rider plates to make the fingers actually work better, to hold on to things and to not get injured. Now these, because they're made by like one guy in a very small shop, they're very expensive. They're probably like Pro Gauntlet ×2. But the guy doesn't make them at scale because there just is no demand. There's not the kind of demand for that. Now, if, hypothetically, we wanted to have more of these types of protective gear, they could be made at scale. As a matter of fact, other people would start making them at scale to the point they could be common. And I'll tell you, when I was trying them out, when I was interviewing the guy, they were so light. I mean, they did give any plastic gauntlet a run for its money, because titanium is ridiculously strong and can be made ridiculously thin, and it's ridiculously light to begin with. So if there was demand for this type of stuff, it could be made. It could be made even better or even more available. So do I think there's a need? Yeah, I think that maybe Sellsword Art's reasons and my reasons might be a little different. But I did want to say that there's stuff out there that's available. That's not to say that we shouldn't control our hitting and fighting better. That we shouldn't, perhaps if you really want the edge in terms of weight, that maybe something like this, those extra few ounces of difference, is a price too high. But something like a future titanium glove, especially one developed for Blossfect and HEMA, would be ridiculously effective. And I think it would be incredibly popular. Also, we got to think about, it's not just for tournament use. As we want to explore different things in HEMA without going fully into harness fectin, which some people don't, we need to take a look at alternatives. And this is already being done. People are fighting in half armor, doing just the breastplate. There are people already doing that. Is the fact that it's armor shaped the problem? I see tons of the Mac armor, and that's plastic, but it's clearly shaped and clearly inspired by historical armor. I'm kind of just not really seeing a lot of the arguments. One of the last arguments that I think has been said is that, well, if you hit metal, it would sound like sword strikes. And I talked about this in the comments of my other video. And that is that unsecured metal, which means if you hold like a sword in one hand and you don't hold the other part, has a ring to it. It's very different than the sound of secured metal, which means things that are attached at more than one point. And certainly the type of metal matters. Titanium has a very tinny type sound to the strike that's very different from sword on sword. And I would argue that any type of secured where there are more than one point attached, it doesn't have a free part to ring, is going to sound different than it would if it were sword on sword. It might take some time for people who are unfamiliar to be able to make that distinction, but I think it's something that wouldn't work itself out over time as more metal gauntlets were being introduced. So once again, thank you for listening to me talk about these different gauntlets, the pros and the cons, the differences for what they might be used for. And as I said, if you're curious about the titanium gauntlets, in my description I will have a video link, and I'll put a timestamp so you don't have to watch the whole thing to see the part about titanium gauntlets. Once again, this is Ramirez with Tidewater Renaissance Fighting Arts, and I will see you in the next video.